I was born in Vienna, Austria. I had a wonderful childhood. I had everything a child needs. Loving parents, that's a picture of my family. And I had a lot of aunts and uncles. Okay?
Yep.
And went on vacation. Here you have a picture of a school outing, vacation. That's the last picture I took in Vienna. And I loved my school, had a lot of friends. And Vienna is a beautiful city. Went on vacations every summer and had a wonderful life. I was born March the 1st, 1923. So,
How did life change when the Nazis came to power?
well, Hitler marched into Austria on March the 13th, 1938. Well, the Austrians claimed they were the victims, but there were no victims. They opened Hitler with open arms. As a matter of fact, the government was very weak, and they were told, the army, the Wehrmacht, not to oppose when they marched in, and they didn't. They just welcomed them with open arms, and that was the end of my childhood, the way I knew it. Overnight, you become a non-person. You have no rights. Now, in Germany, Hitler was already in power for a few years, so every year another law came out. You couldn't go to school, couldn't go to a movie, couldn't even sit on the bench in the park. Well, in Austria, within 24 hours, all those laws were enforced. And neighbors, Jews lived in Austria for hundreds of years. They were pillars of the community. I never felt any difference before. And overnight, people changed. That was so hard to understand. Like I had a girlfriend, school friend, who lived next door, who was a Catholic girl. We never had any difference. I went to her house Christmas, helping her decorate the Christmas tree. She liked to come to my house Passover, have matzo ball soup. We never had any difference about our religions. But after Hitler came, she was afraid to talk to me because she was not allowed to have any contact with Jewish people. So it was very hard to absorb all that.
What were some examples of the anti-Semitism that you encountered in Austrian society?
You mean after Hitler marched in?
Yes.
Oh, well, people disappeared. People left the house. They were beaten up or they never came back. Of course, then was Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass. That was in 1938. They came into our home, arrested my father, who ended up in Dachau concentration camp, helped themselves to whatever they want. Now, you'll think you called the police. You couldn't because they were one of them. There was absolutely nothing you could do. I remember my sister and I were hiding and were hoping that they're not going to hurt my mother. And of course, she was hysterical when they took my father away. And it took 3 weeks before we got a postcard that is in Dachau concentration camp. And really, that was the beginning of the Shoah, Kristallnacht. Hitler waited. How will the world react to what he has done? The world was quiet. So Hitler knew he can do what he wants to do, and he surely did it.
What happened to you and your siblings after your father was taken away?
Well, my mother realized that she has to save her children. Right after Kristallnacht, my brother went to France. He went illegally and was in Paris. Now, in Europe, you needed identity cards. Of course, he had none. So the French police stopped him as he had no identity card. They were going to send him back. You can imagine what would happen if they would send him back. So he joined the French Foreign Legion and ended up in Africa. That's in the French Foreign Legion uniform. And during the war, when the British came to North Africa, he joined the British Army and was fighting the Nazis. And as I said, my mother went from place to place to save her children. Right after Kristallnacht, there was one country who had some compassion, that was England. Right after Kristallnacht, they had a debate in Parliament. What could they do? And they decided to take in an unspecified number of children. They had to be under 17 years of age and come alone. That is called the Kindertransport. You know, when I speak to school children today, it is very hard for them to understand. With social media and television, you know what happens in the world instantly. Now, in 1938, we didn't have that. I had no idea where England was. I had to look in an atlas to find it. Never met an Englishman. As far as I'm concerned, England could have been in outer space. It was very scary going to a foreign country, don't know the language, and you don't know who's going to take care of you, and if you're ever going to see your parents again. Now, Kristallnacht was in November. December the 2nd, the first Kindertransport arrived in England. They came from Berlin, from an orphanage, which was destroyed at Kristallnacht. Between December and the following August, just before war broke out, 10,000 children were saved. 90% of all those children never saw their parents again. This is the picture of the first children arriving in England, and this is the lady who took me in.
What was her name? Do you remember her name?
Mrs. Butcher. Her son was a member of Parliament, and my aunt and my cousin, my aunt came as a cook to the Member of Parliament, and his mother took me in, so I knew where I was going. She was an elderly lady, very kind. She wanted me as a companion. The people who took in the children were responsible until they were 18 years of age. I remember the day I left. It was March the 13th, 1939. I only remember the date because it was the 1-year anniversary of Hitler marching into Austria, and they had parades going. It was Jubilant Day in Vienna. And in the railway station, we were in the train, the windows tightly closed. I'm inside, my mother outside. For 4 agonizing hours, the train stood there. I was afraid to get away from the window because I was afraid I'm going to lose her forever. That's over 80 years ago, and to this day, I cannot stand anybody seeing me off. It left that impression on me of seeing my mother there. You know, I remember my aunt had 4 children, having a violent argument with my mother. She called my mother a rotten mother. How can you set your children away? How can you do that? You know, until I became a mother, did I realize they were both right. What a mother wants to do, hold you close. But I truly believe my mother gave birth to me twice. When I was born, and when she had the strength and the foresight to send me out on the kindertransport. I don't remember how many children, but there were little ones, 2-year-old, 3-year-olds, who had no idea what happened to them. They just cried for their mothers. They grew up in England as nice boys and girls, and if somebody survived and came for them, they couldn't even remember them because they were too young.
What was the train ride like?
We went from Vienna through Germany and to Holland. Just before we came to the border, the Nazis came in. We were only allowed a small suitcase, only personal belongings, nothing of value. They opened some suitcases, threw it all over and yelled at us. If anybody smuggled anything, back you go. We were scared, but nothing happened. Then we came over the border in Holland and we felt free. And there were some ladies on the platform and they gave us hot chocolate and sandwiches. It's the first time I ever saw white bread. I never saw it before.
What would you have?
And then we went by boat over the channel to England. It was quite a culture shock. Everything was different. The food was different. And when you're young, you're very particular. I thought the food was terrible. But you had to be in your best behavior. I was afraid they might send me back. So I had to learn the language. And the lady who took me in did not only take me in to save my life, she wanted to save my soul. I should accept Jesus Christ as my Savior. If I would have been younger, not come from a traditional Jewish home, would have been so easy. A new country, a new language, why not a new religion? But I was 15. I knew who I was. And I went to church twice on Sunday. It was very peaceful, and I enjoyed going. But I never walked away from my religion because otherwise Hitler would have won. And we did some war work. I worked in the aircraft factory making wings of airplanes. And of course, then we had the war started. We had the Blitz, we had the bombing. So it was very difficult.
Did you tell anybody you were Jewish at work, or did you make any friends?
Yes, the young people took me in. They really were extremely nice. And I had a good time living. It was the suburbs of London. And then I went to London. I had to find a job and make a life of myself.
Did the bombing of London or the Blitz, the bombing of London
Yes,
affect
we
you?
had to go into shelters every night. And I remember when, particular after the Blitz, when the pilotless planes came over, we called them the doodlebugs. We learned that if you hear the engine stop, you were safe because it goes down slowly. If you don't hear the engine, you never know if it hits you or not.
What was your thinking and fear in terms of your family at that point?
Well, you're always worried. Once war broke out, we had no communication with my parents. I had no idea where they are. Now, my sister, who was already 18, she couldn't come on the Kindertransport. But England took in people who needed their skill. They needed maids, they needed domestic. So my sister came to England as a maid. Believe me, at home she didn't do a darn thing. But you do what you have to do to survive.
Discuss what happened towards the end of the war and how the transition between wartime and post-war.
I remember it was very fascinating. We were watching the dogfights of the British Air Force and the German Spitfires. And it's really the British Air Force who saved England because they knew they had to win, because Hitler tried to invade England, but they could never do it.
Did you ever encounter any American troops?
Yes, once the American came over just before D-Day, there were a lot of Americans, and they came with a lot of money, beautiful uniform. They had a good time in England, because all the girls wanted the Americans, because they had the food. And a friend of mine, she got married to an American soldier, and he bought all the food from their places, because we had very tight rations.
How would you describe your state of mind throughout the war?
During the war,
describe yourself as you were worried, of course, about your family. How scared were you? How were you confident that this would be over? Were you petrified?
we were petrified because we were worried. I don't know where my brother during the war came to England. As I said, he joined the British Army, and then he was stationed in Germany and was fighting the Nazis. But you never knew. For instance, my sister, who went to work, who took the same bus at the same time every day. One day she overslept and took a later bus, and that earlier bus was bombed. So, you never knew when it's going to hit you, when the bombs hit you or not. So it was scary, because at first Hitler invaded all the countries. The war looked very bad, so we were very scared. And we heard the rumors what happened to the Jews when we heard about the killing camp, the final solution. It wasn't easy.
Did you keep your Judaism quiet?
Once I came to London myself, I could keep Judaism alive. But while I was with Mrs. Butcher, I couldn't.
Can you describe what happened at the end of the war and how you found out about your family?
Well, the end of the war, I remember when the war was over and the newsreels came out of the British and the American and the Russian liberating the camps, and we saw all those dead bodies. I said, well, it could be my parents. We had no idea. Particularly in one movie house where a lot of the refugees were living. They were fainting and screaming in the movie when they saw the newsreels. It was scary. And the Germans kept very good records when people were transported, how they died. So the Red Cross and organizations had the list, and people went every day to find out where their loved ones perished. So I know that we didn't know anything about my parents, and I really had nightmares about the camps, about the newsreels I saw. It took 4 months. We got a letter from the Red Cross. Was afraid to open it because it means either they're dead or alive. They went through hell but survived. They were in Hungary. You see, when my father was in Dachau concentration camp, at that time Hitler just wanted to get rid of the Jews. If you had somewhere to go, you'd come out of the camp. The final solution came in 41, came much later. So he could come out of Dachau. My mother bought the ticket of Shanghai, but he couldn't go with it. But it was enough to show the Gestapo. But he had to leave Vienna within 2 weeks. So he went to Budapest, Hungary, because we had family there. He had somewhere to live. And I think he got my mother over to Budapest as well. They went through hell, but they survived. After the war, well, as once we found that my parents are alive, the Russians, Hungary was one of the last countries Hitler invaded. By that time, they knew about Auschwitz, they knew about the cattle cars, they knew about what is happening. And my mother was picked up on the street to go on the column to the railway station. She knew that's the end of her. She saw a ditch. She said, well, if they see me, they shoot me. She jumped, but nobody saw her. She had that strength. She has to see her children again. And as I said, the Russian liberated Hungary, so it was all communist. And money had no value, but we sent cigarettes and coffee. With that, they could bribe their exit visa to leave Hungary and come to England. And they came to England and still made a life for themselves. So as I said, my immediate family, we all survived. But I told you my aunt, who had the 4 children, who called my mother, godmother, they all perished. I had a lot of aunts and uncles and cousins. No idea whatever happened to them. Never heard of them again.
When your immediate family came to England,
Yeah.
did they also stay with Mrs. Butcher or a separate?
No, by that time I already was 18. I was in London. I had found a job and made a life for myself. So by that time, I was already in London. I was married in London. My husband was in the British Army, and he was a refugee from Germany. And he always wanted to come to America. He had his sister was a GI bride, and his father was here. So I came to the United States in 1947. I really wasn't happy coming because I just found my parents, my family, but in all those years I've gone back and they've come here visiting. My brother and sister stayed in England, and I haven't missed any bar mitzvah, any wedding. I went to all of them. So we're very close with my nephews.
When you land in England, do you feel, what do you feel when you go back to England?
Oh, I feel like England is like my, I had my youth there, I got married there. I felt always it's like my hometown. But one day I was thinking, I was born in Vienna. Something was there. So that summer we were going to London, and I asked my brother and sister, would they come with me to Vienna? So the spouses stayed in London, and my brother and sister went for 4 days to Vienna, and I called it a walk through my childhood. And it was very peculiar feeling because all the memories came back. I remember we were in a park, I sat on the bench, and I saw some writing on the bench. I jumped up like crazy because I remembered used to say, Juden verboten, Jews not allowed to sit there. All it said, property of Vienna, but nowhere else would I have that reaction but in Vienna. But I've been there invited to speak to school children, which I have done, which was very interesting.
What language do you speak when you do that?
Both. I try to do it in German, but it's very difficult because I haven't used the language. But most of the kids said they understand English, so I had half and half. I managed.
It's almost like you belong to 3 different countries.
Yeah. So, but I know when I have 2 children and 4 granddaughters. I know when my daughter became 15, I looked at her and I said, you don't know how lucky you are to be born in this country. So,
What do you think about what's happening politically in this country? Are you seeing any parallels?
no.
When you talk to students, what are some of the lessons that you share with them?
Well, I usually end to say that we're telling you the story of the Holocaust to show you where hate can lead to. Don't be a bystander. If something happens, speak up, be an upstander. If more people would have spoken up, it might not have happened. Only with education can you prevent things like this happening.
What would you like people to remember about you and your experiences?
The what?
What would you like people to remember about your story and your experiences?
To remember to respect people for what they are, for their differences. And as I said, hate is the worst thing. I remember once a high school girl asked me, do you hate them? So my answer was, if I hate them, I'm as bad as they are. I'll never forget and never forgive.
How should people respond to human rights violations today?
It's wrong, and as I said, what you need is education, because very often when kids put swastikas all over, they don't even understand what that symbol means. The same if they put a noose, they don't understand what it means for the black community. That's why education is so important, to make them realize what those symbols stand for. And most of the time, when the kids know, they stop doing it. Because I remember there was a case in Long Island where kids were putting graffiti like this. And the judge was very smart. He didn't send them to prison. He told them they have to go to the Holocaust Center in Glen Cove with their parents and come back in 3 months with an essay, what they have learned. And when they came back, they all said, I don't know why we did what we did. So that's why I say education is the most important thing, to stop hate and stop any discrimination.
And when did you decide to speak to youth about the Holocaust and your experience?
It took for most survivors a long time until we could talk about it. Now, I was lucky enough to see my mother, right? I never asked her, how did you get me on the Kindertransport? How did you feel at the railway station when you said goodbye to me? never talked about it. So I remember we went on a trip to different estates on Long Island. We ended up at Glen Cove, which is the Pratt estate. And I was so impressed, and I went up to the person. I said, I'd like to be a docent here. And that's over 20 years ago, and I'm still doing it.
When you became a mother, did you get a better sense of what your mother might have been feeling?
Yes, definitely. Definitely. I really wondered what strength it takes for mothers to send their children away.
Did you realize at the time that she was saving your life, or did you realize only until you became a mother?
No, I realized, I was old enough to realize that she did it. I know that most of the parents told the children, don't worry, we'll follow you in a week, to make them feel better. But of course, I said that 90% of those children never saw their parents again. And very funny feeling is there is a guilt of survival. When after the war, when all the lists came out, and I met friends, and they told me Auschwitz, Treblinka, where their parents died, I felt guilty to say that mine survived. It was a very, very peculiar feeling.
Do you feel less guilty now? Understanding the...
Yes, of course. Now I don't think about that anymore. I'm just more concerned of it should never happen again.
Do you ever encounter anything in your travels or food or things that trigger your memory when you encounter Germans or the German language, or when you travel to England? Are there certain memory triggers that speak to you whenever if you see them? Or
not so much, no, but particularly when I went back to Vienna, I felt it there. It triggered all the memories, all the bad times. The only thing is that important that we need more education of history, because some of the people never heard about the Holocaust, didn't know, and that's why it's so important to keep our stories alive, because it's the only way I feel we can prevent it from ever happening again.
And we just want to say, as always, thank you for being a part of the Kupferberg Holocaust Center. Thank you for speaking with our students so often as you do. And I'm glad we were able to put your testimony on video in our archives so that students can learn about the Holocaust and learn about you and your family and your story.
And this is the last generation who will hear testimony from survivors.
That's right. So I'm really glad
So that's so important to do it as long as we can.
Thank you for sharing.
Pleasure was mine.
Yeah.